All right. All right. Thank you, Kara. Well, it's my pleasure to present Karen Vanderwolf, who is a bat expert. And she did her undergrad at Western University, where she lives in London, or at least that's where she grew up. She did her master's at the University of New Brunswick, and she's working on her PhD at Trent, very good university. When I went there, they didn't even have a PhD program. But she's been studying bats since 2006, and she is going to tell us something we didn't know about bats and the program that she's involved in. So thank you very much, Karen. The floor is yours.
Okay, can you enable participant sharing? Screen sharing, sorry.
Yeah, do you see our green share screen on the bottom?
That's okay. No, I got it. Go ahead. Sorry, Karen. Remember I told you that would happen.
There we go. So everybody can see the slides? I'm going to guess yes?
Yes, we can see them just fine.
Great. Yeah, so I'm in Peterborough, so I'm not too far away from you guys actually. But yeah, so today I'll be talking all about bats. And yeah, my internet isn't the best either, but usually it's okay. But if there's any technical difficulties, feel free to speak up because I don't always notice on my end. But hopefully we go smoothly. So to just sort of introduce bats, a big overview of bats, there's actually over 1,400 species of bats. They actually make up 25% of all mammal species. The only other group that has more species are the rodents, which are even bigger. But the bats as a group are pretty big, and they also range quite a bit in size. So on the left there, that's one of the flying foxes. That one's found in Asia. So they can have up to 6-foot wingspan, so they get pretty big. There's also really small bats. So on the right is the smallest bat in the world. It's called the bumblebee bat, and that is a full-grown adult in the picture. They are found in Thailand, so quite a size range there. There's also a lot of range in color. So when you think of bats, you think like brown, black, or something like that. But they come in a lot of different colors. So here's some lovely white bats found in Central America. I think they're pretty cute. And one of my favorites, the painted bat found in Asia. I think this is like the best Halloween bat ever. I don't know why we're using all black one. They should use this one because it's real. Here's a nice panda bat found in Africa. You can see why it's called panda with the lovely black and white coloration. And the yellow winged bat, so that has a really bright yellow wings, hence the name. Not very creative with the names here, but it's fine. It gives you a lot of information about the species. So that's also quite striking. So in terms of what bats eat, a lot of bats eat fruit, so frugivores. Especially the bigger bats, they eat a lot of fruit. There's also a lot of pollinators. So for instance, as close to us as the American South, you get some bats that perform pollinator services. And those are responsible for some of our fruit crops like bananas. And this one is pollinating some cacti. So if you ever like tequila, you should think of bat because they're pollinating the cacti that produce it. There's also carnivorous bats, so bats that eat small mammals, bats that eat frogs, and bats that eat other bats. So this one, as you see, specializes in frogs, although the photographer told me that this particular picture, the frog actually got away, which is kind of amazing because it doesn't look good for the frog right now. There's also fishing bats. So if you've ever seen an osprey fish for food, they're dragging their legs in the water to catch fish, and the bats do the same thing. So they exclusively eat fish. There's only a few species that do that. And of course, maybe you've heard of vampire bats. So out of the over 1,400 species of bats that are alive, only 3 of them actually drink blood, and they are all found in Central and South America. They go as far north as Mexico, but no farther. So of course, you'll never see a vampire bat here outside of the zoo. Of those 3 species that drink blood, 2 of them are more specialized on birds. so not mammals. But one of them, the common vampire bat, does target mammals and will occasionally try out a human. But this certainly isn't a common thing among bats in general. And here in Canada, all of our 19 bat species eat insects and nothing but insects. So we don't have any bats that eat fruit. We don't have pollinators here. It's all about the moths and mosquitoes and a whole bunch of other different insects. They eat quite a variety. So the colorful bats aren't exclusive to the tropics. We also have some color here. So there's the lovely red bat. I'm sure you can tell which one is that. Which is very pretty. And in the middle there, that's a silver-haired black bat. So we were talking about that a little earlier. It's looks a little more black than some of the other species. And then on the right there is the biggest bat in Canada, the hoary bat. So of course, big is relative. Big here is like 30 grams, 35 grams, not that big. So I was lucky enough to catch my first red bat in the summer of 2019. And I was really lucky because it was a male. So red bats are actually a little unusual among bats in Canada in that they're sexually dimorphic. So the males are actually more brightly colored than the females. So kind of like birds like that. So I got the lovely bright colored male. And this is the big brown bat. So this is something you might find in a bat box. They're pretty common. They will also hibernate in your attic over the winter, unlike other bat species. This particular bat was actually found flying around the University of New Brunswick in the winter around one of the classrooms. People didn't seem to appreciate that. So we got it back to our lab where we kept it over the winter and fed it mealworms. You can see mealworm hanging out of its mouth there. And then released it in the spring. And there's a variety of other small bats found here in Ontario. So the top left there is the tricolored bat. That one is obviously hibernating in a mine. And then at the bottom left is the northern long-eared bat. Top right is the little brown bat. And then there's the small-footed bat. So these all look fairly similar. So when I show these pictures, it's kind of hard to tell relative size of these species to each other. So I like showing these photos. It's the same two individuals, it's just different camera angles. So I took this picture in Ontario in a mine in December, I think it was 2019, yeah. And when I show this to people, they're like, oh, look, it's so cute. It's a mother and baby. But no, actually, baby bats are born in June and they reach adult size after a month. So after a month, you can't tell adults from juveniles based on size alone. And of course, I took this in December. So these are both full-grown adults, but they're different species. So one is the big brown bat and the other one is the little brown bat. And I'm sure you can tell which is which. There's quite the size difference. But when we're identifying these bat species, we don't just use size. Size is kind of relative. You kind of develop an eye for it. So for these two, we also look at color. So maybe you notice here that the big brown bats are really lovely chocolate color. The fur is very glossy, very shiny, but then you look at the little brown bat, it's kind of a dull brown. The fur is not glossy. So this is something we use to identify the bats, especially when we're doing some of these counts in the caves. So I just want to go over the life cycle of bats. So they're very long lived. So a little brown bat can weigh typically about 10 grams. So you're thinking like mouse size here. But a mouse might live 2-3 years in the wild maybe. But a little brown bat can live up to 40 years in the wild. They're really long lived. And little brown bats and the other species will only have one pup per year. So they don't have litters that can't respond to big mortality events by having huge litters. It's just one pup per year. Like humans, they can occasionally have twins, it happens, but the norm is the one pup per year. There are some species that differ from that. So for example, the red bat actually normally has twins, which is a little different from some of these other species. So I want to go over the life cycle starting with maternity roosts. So we are in maternity season now. The females will be pregnant. They will have congregated by now at their maternity sites. So they like warm sites and they like being in big colonies. And this brings me to my National Bat Box project, which is a 3-year citizen science project. I'm going to go over it for a while here. So why are we looking at bat boxes? So traditionally, bats, for their roofs, they choose large trees, so hollow trees, trees with loose bark they can crawl under, like the one shown here that was taken in New Brunswick. But of course, with urbanization, we've cut down a lot of the big trees. It's really hard to find old growth now, so it's really hard to find these great roost trees for bats. So we're trying to replace that lost habitat, the lost roosting habitat particularly, with these bat boxes that are, the goal is to mimic these tree roosts. So providing these crevices. And particularly to help some of these endangered species that have really, in recent years, come under a lot of pressure from diseases like white nose syndrome, which I'll talk about a lot later, and being hit by wind turbines, habitat loss. There's quite the list of threats. So with these bat boxes, of course, we want to try to maximize reproductive success. So to do that, we want warm roosts, because if you have a warm roost where the pups are, the pups can put all of their energy or most of their energy into growth, getting big fast, instead of trying to keep themselves warm. That is going to increase the likelihood that they can survive their first year, which of course is usually the hardest year to survive when you're trying to learn to fly and catch insects and go into hibernation and all the things that bats need to do. So the thermal properties of your bat boxes are really important, not just for, of course, the pups, but also for the mothers, because they are putting a lot of their energy into feeding their pups. And it's nice for them to conserve their energy in a warm roost so they don't have to spend their energy keeping warm. So I took this picture in Prince Edward Island in 2019. Maybe you guessed from the lovely, iconic red dirt in the background there. And this is a very successful little brown bat maternity colony. It's not the way we usually recommend you set up your bat boxes, as they're quite close to the ground. This gives better access to predators like cats and raccoons to access the boxes. Plus, the females, especially when they're pregnant or carrying their baby out foraging, which they sometimes do, they need a lot of room to sort of drop out of the bottom of the box and get airborne before hitting the ground. But nevertheless, this is a very successful roost, which is great because, of course, 2019, when I took this photo, this is post-white nose syndrome. So it's great to see these guys surviving and reproducing. So I've talked a lot about warm roosts, how we want heat in our bat boxes, but it looks like we've carried these recommendations a little too far in some cases, because now we're seeing overheating bat boxes, boxes that are getting too hot. So for instance, in British Columbia and the Yukon, they have documented temperatures in some bat boxes that are over 50 degrees, which is lethal. And they have documented some mortality events of bats due to these overheating boxes, particularly of the flightless pups, who of course can't just leave and go somewhere else. But also sometimes even the adults will succumb. If they don't have another roost to fly to, if they don't have a choice, they can get stuck in some of these unsuitable roosts. So we're kind of looking like a Goldilocks kind of situation here. We want a warm roost, like between 27 and 38 degrees or so, but we don't want it too warm. So we're trying to hit that happy medium. This kind of overheating events, it likely happens across Canada, especially if it's happening in the Yukon, but it hasn't been documented just because nobody's really looking. So that's one of the goals of my national project. So which bat species actually use bat boxes? So there are 19 bat species in Canada, but we've actually only documented 3 bat species using bat boxes here. Partly that might be because just the lack of research. There's very little research on bat boxes in Canada. We based most of our recommendations on bat boxes on research done in Europe and United States. So of course, the climate in Canada is a little different. So the other goal, one of the other goals of my project is to produce better recommendations for bat boxes to try to increase success rates. But the bat species in Canada that are known to use bat boxes are the little brown bat, the big brown bat, and in British Columbia, the Yuma bat. Yuma bats don't occur in Ontario, so you're not going to see one of those. So what kind of designs are out there? There's a lot of different designs. So on the far left there, that picture was taken in British Columbia. That's a bat box. It's actually made out of concrete. More technically, it's woodcrete. So it's a mixture of concrete and wood. This kind of design is really popular in Europe. It does have a few advantages over what you might think of a normal bat box made of wood. But it can really buffer against temperature changes on the outside. So it does have some advantages. I don't know of many of these types of boxes in Canada. There's a few in British Columbia. I know of one in Ontario, and there's a few in Newfoundland. So I'm really curious to see how successful those are. In the center there are more of the box designs you might be used to. So the big, long, tall ones, those are called rocket boxes. Sometimes they're really successful, sometimes not. We're not sure. And then, of course, the more standard sort of 3 to 4 chamber standard box. On the far right there, that's a picture I took in Pinery Provincial Park here in Ontario. That's a bat condo. So you can think of it like a supersized bat box. So instead of holding hundreds of bats, you can hold thousands of bats. This particular condo does have a little brown bat colony. At the last count, which was in 2019, it only had about 150 little brown bats. It can hold thousands, not just 150, but at least it's something, especially post-white nose syndrome. So I've gone over some of my project goals, but overall, I want to know what kind of bat boxes are used in Canada. So both what types of boxes are people installing and what kinds of boxes are the bats using, which of course are 2 different things. And is the bat box used? Is there differences in the species, what they prefer? So for instance, do big brown bats prefer like a slightly larger chamber width than the little brown bats, that sort of thing. And part of this, of course, relates to microclimate. So what is the microclimate in these different bat boxes with different designs and different placements? Are we getting overheating bat boxes throughout Canada? Under what circumstances do these overheating events happen, and how can we prevent it while still maintaining those nice warm temperatures that the bats like? These are the sort of questions I'm hoping to answer with this project. And the pictures there, I took those in New Brunswick in 2019. That's just another successful little brown bat maternity colony. And actually one of the little brown bats we caught was carrying her pup there. You can see it's nursing. So that was really exciting for me because I had followed the impact of white nose syndrome in New Brunswick over several years. And it's nice to see that there are still healthy bats there that are reproducing. So if you're interested in participating in the project, I didn't put the web address for the project because nobody wants to copy that down because it's not fun to copy down. But if you just Google like Canadian Bat Box Project, Wildlife Conservation Society Bat Box, something like that, it'll come up pretty easily. It's not too hard to find. So what participation involves is you should already have a bat box or plan to get one soon. It is a 3-year project and this is the first summer, so there's certainly time. And then you fill out an online multiple choice survey with a bunch of questions about the physical properties of your box and how it's placed on your property. After that, you want to monitor your box by doing emergence counts. There's a very detailed protocol on how to do this on the website. But just briefly, what this involves is sitting by your bat box for an hour around sunset and counting how many bats come out of your box. If you're just installing the box this year, it's probably not worth your time to do an emergence count this year, but certainly next year. So for newsletters, I plan to send out 2 newsletters a year, one in the spring and one in the fall. And I just sent out the first one last month. And so this project is a big national effort in partnership with the Canadian Wildlife Federation and the Wildlife Conservation Society. So I have had about 870 people sign up so far. Ontario, of course, is where I get the majority of my participants. I think Ontario is about 300 people by now, pretty close anyway. And you can sort of see the distribution of participants, which of course mirrors the distribution of the human population in Canada. I've also certainly gotten a good response from the Maritimes, which is very nice to see. So here in Ontario, you can also sign up for Bat Watch. So another goal of the project is to try to encourage long-term stewardship of bats. So that means monitoring your bat population beyond the project length. This is just a 3-year project, but Bat Watch goes much longer. So you can also register your roost, and this is not confined to bat boxes. You could have bats in your house. You could see a bat flying down the street. You can report it to Bat Watch here. And you can see all the reports there with the little icons. So they're very active in Southern Ontario. And there's a lot of great information on this website about bats if you'd like to learn more. Oh, this didn't work again. Oh, well. So I want to continue on with my life cycle story and talk about swarming. So swarming is the mating season for bats, and that happens from August to October. So the bats swarm, if you will, at potential hibernacula, so caves and mines. And they visit multiple caves and mines during this season, going from cave to cave and checking out the social scene. They're very polygamous. After swarming comes hibernation. So as I mentioned, all the bats in Canada eat insects. You probably noticed there's not a lot of insects around in the winter. So they do go from about October to late April, early May, depending where in Canada you are, without eating. So they don't eat at all. They're just living off their fat reserves. So can you imagine going for that length of time, just living off a few grams of fat? This is an amazing thing that they do. They're really walking a fine line there of survival. So the way they can survive for so long without eating is, of course, to down-regulate everything, get their metabolism down to the absolute minimum by suppressing their immune system and lowering their body temperature to the temperature of their ambient environment. So in these caves and mines, in Canada anyway, depending where you are, it's about 5 degrees. They cannot hibernate in a place that goes below freezing. That will kill them. So you're never going to see bats in your bat box in the winter, although you will see them as late as October, which is pretty neat, but not during the winter. They've got to be in a stable environment with high humidity in order to survive. So during this pandemic, we've learned a lot about social distancing. And as you see from the photo, the bats are not social distancing. So you can imagine that this is very conducive to disease spread, which is my next topic, white nose syndrome, which is caused by a fungus, not a virus like COVID. So it's a little different. So what it does, it grows on all the exposed skin surfaces of bats. And it really, it wakes the bats up too often during hibernation so that they're burning through their fat reserves at an accelerated rate. So they wake up too early and they're starving and there's no food and we get high mortality rates. They do have a small immune response to the fungus during the winter, but because everything is so down-regulated, the immune system can't control the fungus at that time. Once the bats wake up, if they survive the winter, once they wake up in about May, the immune system wakes up too and goes bananas and can defeat the fungus. As long as the bat is still alive by the end of the winter, they can recover from the disease. The fungus, the disease, they don't get that in the summer. The fungus cannot grow above 20 degrees. So any organism that does not put their body temperature below 20 degrees is not going to get the disease. And during the summer, the bats don't do that either, so they don't get the disease in the summer, just when they're hibernating in the winter. So this fungus is an invasive species. We think it's from either Europe or Asia, where it's native, somewhere in there. And we think what happened is someone is human transmitted from one of those areas here to North America. It first showed up in a commercial cave in Albany, New York, and we first saw it in 2006. So probably somebody went caving in Europe or Asia. They had like mud on their boot or something. They went into this commercial cave. The mud fell off. They spread the spores, unknowingly, of course. We had no idea this fungus existed until it started killing bats in North America. So that's how we think it started. So it started with the big red X there in Albany, New York, right there. And then it's just spread out from there. And the colors, it's color coded based on what year we first found it in that geographic location. So you can see it's spread almost everywhere by this time. The only places in Canada where it's not found now are Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, and the Northern Territories. Saskatchewan's kind of interesting actually, because we don't actually know of any bat hibernacula in the province. That's not to say that there aren't any, but we just don't know of any. It's not exactly karst country. That is, it doesn't have a lot of caves or mines that we know of. But nevertheless, white nose might show up there, and it's certainly in Seattle, that area there, Washington State. So it's not very far from the British Columbia border. It might, I mean, for all we know, it might already be in British Columbia, but they haven't found it yet. They are looking, but of course you can't prove it's not there. You never know. But you can see this has spread very fast since, this is just since 2006. So very fast spread across the continent. And this is just a quick look at what the fungus looks like. This is under the microscope. So this sort of stringy stuff, that's the hyphae. And then you have the spores. So the reproductive structures are these sort of scimitar-shaped spores. And these are cross-section histology of a bat wing. So on the right here is a healthy bat wing. So the black arrows are pointing to features in the wing like blood vessels, muscle fibers, that sort of thing. On the left there is an infected bat wing. So the solid purple, all of that is fungal hyphae. So the fungus has replaced the muscles and blood vessels with hyphae, with itself. So you can imagine a bat like that is going to have a very hard time flying with no muscle anymore. And of course, the fungus is punching holes through the skin as well. So the bat is losing a lot of electrolytes, a lot of water. Dehydration is one of the main causes of death for these bats. So this is actually a very unusual fungal infection for mammals. Generally, mammals don't have a lot of trouble with fungus compared to plants or insects because of our warm body temperatures and because of our awesome immune system. When you get immunocompromised, that's when things get really scary with fungi. And so a fungal disease like this is really unusual, especially for wildlife. But it seems to be becoming more common as we keep moving fungus around the globe with our world trade system. So this is just showing what a bat looks like when it has heavy fungal infection. So all the white pinpricks there, that's the fungus. So I know it's called white nose syndrome, but it's not just the nose, it's any part of the exposed skin surface that you can get the fungus growing. It was called white nose syndrome because when you go into a cave to count the bats, you're looking up at the ceiling, they're hanging down from the ceiling. The first thing you see is the nose. And of course, especially with that white fungus, it really stands out in the glow of your headlamp. And plus it's kind of a cool name, right? So this is just showing the effect of the fungus on the wing. So the black arrow is pointing to a section of the wing that looks, it's still pretty good. It's still pretty healthy. It's got elastic properties still. It doesn't have many holes. But the white arrow is pointing to a part of the wing that has been severely affected by the disease. So it kind of looks like crumpled tissue paper. It's lost that nice elasticity. And this bat clearly is in big trouble. So, but not all bat species are affected by this disease. So some bat species, like the migratory bats, the red bats, the silver-haired bats, and the hoary bats, are not affected by this disease at all. They don't hibernate. They go south for the winter, smart bats. So they avoid this disease completely. But even among bats that hibernate in caves in the winter, there's variation in the disease's impact. So for example, big brown bats will hibernate in caves in the winter, but their mortality rate from this disease is only about 30%, which obviously is still not great, but it's better than the little brown bat, whose mortality rate is more like 90% from this disease. And I could give a whole other talk about why this might be, why we're seeing these sort of species differences. But yeah, I'll sort of spare you that because I can go on a long time about that one. That's part of what my PhD is about. So management, what can we do about this? So in the beginning, the big thing we're focusing on is trying to minimize the spread of disease. We can't really control the movement of bats, and bats do seem to be the main vector that spreads this disease. But all we could try to do was control the movement of humans. So humans first introduced the disease. We were hoping to prevent the spread west by minimizing the movement of people from cave to cave, especially trying to decontaminate any gear that was in an infected cave. This isn't just about, of course, spreading the fungus. It's also about disturbing bats during the winter. So you don't want to go into hibernacula during the winter because even if you're very quiet, just your lights will wake up the bats, and that's going to accelerate at the rate at which they burn up their fat reserves. And if they're disturbed too much, it can lead to increased mortality. Because people like to go into some of these sites and have parties and leave trash everywhere. Old story, I'm sure you've heard that one before. So what are the consequences of this disease? In 2012, it was estimated that anywhere from 6 to 7 million bats had died in North America from this disease. Of course, obviously that was a while ago. It's an outdated figure. So what kind of impact is that going to have? So one impact is economic. So all of these bats are eating insects. Some of these insects are forestry pests, agricultural pests. So it was estimated that anywhere from $4 to $56 billion per year was saved by the actions of these bats eating these pests. The bats are no longer there. You have to spread more chemicals to try to control these insect pests. There's also, you would imagine with this kind of mortality, impacts on the ecosystem. So there's a lot of research into these sorts of questions, not by me, but by the larger community. But of course, the really short answer I can give you here is we don't know what kind of impacts, especially long-term impacts, this disease is going to have on a larger ecosystem. So I wanted to go over some of my research in New Brunswick. So I moved to New Brunswick in 2009 to do my master's degree, and I actually stayed for 7 years. So I got a full-time research position there with the New Brunswick Museum and the Canadian Wildlife Federation. So I was very lucky and got to continue my research for several more years on bats. So my study sites were all in the southern part of the province. All the circles are my cave and mine sites. So one thing we did was document the temperatures in these sites, which is sort of where my previous figure of 5 degrees came from. So these temperatures were taken deep in the caves and mines where the bats hibernate. And you can see they don't vary that much over the course of a year. So from about like 7.5 degrees here to about 5 degrees in the winter, which of course outside the caves varies a lot more than that. So these are pretty stable environments. And as you see, they never go below freezing. So when we went into these sites to do the counts, you can see the bats all over the ceilings, and we use these little counters to keep track. And of course, when we did this work, we started before white nose syndrome came into the province, and we were very careful about decontaminating all our gear in between cave visits to make sure that we weren't spreading fungi or other microbes. So this was one of our sites, and we had to go in the winter, and this is called Underground Lake Cave because it has a lake. And in the winter, it's super fun to wade into that to count the bats, because of course the bats like to roost right over the water in the deep part. So yeah, that was nice, wading in that, and I don't really miss that part. I do miss this part. I always love crawling through these tight little spots, sort of shimmying along. And it's always fun giving this presentation in person, because then you can see the looks of horror on people's faces at the thought of doing this kind of thing and enjoying it. But anyway, to each their own, right? And this particular cave was always fun. So the entrance to the cave is actually a chimney. So it's about a 7-foot drop here. So taking this picture, I'm just looking straight up in the air. So in the winter, of course, the whole thing becomes coated in ice. So it's super easy to get into the cave, not so easy getting out of the cave, but we use ropes and stuff, and you can manage. It's doable. And in a lot of these sites, you get these lovely ice formations. So the stalactites and stalagmites at the entrances of the caves, those were always nice to see. And there's actually also tree roots penetrate into these caves. Here in Ontario, I've been in a few caves in Ontario now. I've never seen tree roots, actually. It's kind of odd. But in caves in New Brunswick and Quebec, it's quite common to see this sort of thing. And we actually had paper published just last week looking at the fungus associated with these tree roots. So some of their mycorrhizae fungal associates, which was a very fun project for me. So we're not just looking at natural caves, we're also looking at some of these abandoned mines. So these, of course, the entrances and the tunnels are a lot more uniform than the natural caves. And then it's not just molds and bad molds in these caves. There's also some nice mushrooms that we sometimes see in the dark. And this one was just after one of my spa visits, so I thought the colors went quite nice together. And there's other mammals in these caves as well, not just bats. So we often saw porcupines, and this one was kind enough to pose for a picture right beside the little pile it had made there. And seeing these guys in the caves, I was kind of worried, like if I'd run into one through one of those really tight squeezes where it was really hard, where you couldn't turn around, and backing up would be hard, and the porcupine would get mad and things wouldn't go well for me. But that never actually happened. They were really laid back. They never minded us, really. They were quite happy. Well, maybe not happy. They would pose for pictures, and when they were tired of us, they just kind of wander away slowly. We never had any problems with them, and it was always nice to see. Of course, when it's a -20 outside, it was quite lovely coming in here with its +5. You can see why the porcupines would like it. And it's not just porcupines, there's also mice running around in some of these sites. This one was a very active mouse running around, but it was kind enough to stop for a moment. And in this particular site, they had constructed a lovely nest for themselves deep in the cave. You can see all the shredded wood there. So they lived in there. You can imagine in the winter, it'd be pretty nice. There's no rain, no snow, it's +5. Pretty good. Probably not many predators there because the floor of that particular site is about knee deep in water. So it makes it a little less accessible for other people. So some of my studies that I did with these was to see if the white nose fungus, which I've abbreviated as PD here, was on these mice or on the walls of these caves. So the white nose fungus was certainly all over all of these walls, and it can persist for years without the bats. So even once all the bats are gone, doesn't matter, the fungus can persist and reinfect any bat that happens to go into that site. I did not find the white nose fungus on the mice. Maybe they're too hot, they don't hibernate. So the mice were not vectors. So that was good to know. But I also looked at arthropods in these sites. There's quite a variety of arthropods that also, well, live year round, and some also overwinter in some of these sites. So I wanted to see if the white nose fungus was on those, and it was actually. I looked at 5 different species. It wasn't on the moss, which was kind of nice because the moss would probably travel the farthest. But it was on spiders and harvestmen and a few others. So potentially the arthropods could be a vector for the fungus, but I would not expect the insects to transmit it from like the east coast to the west coast. No. Within the cave, sure, maybe even between caves if the caves are close together, but they're not going to be responsible for this really fast continental spread that we've been seeing with the fungus. Here in Ontario, I don't see a lot of the harvest moths that I showed in the previous photo. I see more tissue moths, which are also pretty, I think, but they're not as common in New Brunswick where I did this study. So moths have their own trouble with fungus in caves. So this is one of the herald moths that has been killed by a fungus called Bavaria. And of course, the fungus is all the white stuff there, and the powdery stuff is all the spores coming out of the poor moth. And this is just another shot of the same thing. You can see all the powder here, all the spores. You can't even see the moth anymore there, but I think it's pretty neat. So I wanted to go over white nose in New Brunswick. So I started my work in New Brunswick in 2009. We didn't see white nose syndrome until 2011. So when we did first see it, which was in March, we came into one of our major sites, and this is what we found. So dead bats all over the floor. You couldn't even walk with stepping on them. They're just everywhere and floating in water, because of course there's some water bodies in some of these sites, so there's lots of carcasses there. And the bats would also, when they get this disease, they often fly to the front of the cave, where the ice area is. So they get frozen, the carcasses get frozen into the ice there. It's thought that they do this sort of in preparation for leaving the cave, which in the dead of winter isn't a great idea, but there's not much else they can think of to do, I guess. And this is the impact it had on the bat population in New Brunswick. So each line here is one of my cave or mine sites. And on the axis here, this is the number of bats, and this is just time, all my surveys. So the first cave we found it in, Predation Cave, which is this line right here, it started at 6,000 bats, so way off the scale. But it got white nose first, and the population just totally crashed here. You can see it actually went to 0 in that site. And one by one, each of my study sites got infected, and you can see the response here. The population just crashed. Some of the sites went to 0 bats, but not all of them. Even when we stopped surveys in the winter of 2015, some of our sites still had bats, even though they had been exposed to this disease for multiple years. So we were supposed to redo these surveys in April 2020. I'm sure you can imagine why that didn't happen. So that got rescheduled for April 2021. Pandemic still hasn't debated. That didn't happen either. So it has been postponed to April 2022. And I'm really hoping we can go, because I'd really be interested to see if there's been a population rebound since the last time we did our surveys. Based on some of the reports I've been hearing and the summer work that I did there in 2019, I am actually expecting to see a bit of a rebound in the population here. Like not a huge rebound, because they're not prolific reproducers. It is just the 1 pup per year. But I did find them reproducing in the summer of 2019. So I do think I'm going to see better news than what I saw in 2015. So here's hoping I can get out there and see what's going on. So in some of these sites, when this happened, there was a lot of carcasses, but of course those decomposed over time. So eventually what you'd see is bones. So all of these sort of straw-like structures, these are all the wing bones of bats that were on the floor of the cave. And of course there's skulls all over the place as well. And when this happened, of course, other animals took note. So especially in this site, some raccoons went into the cave and had quite the buffet. They often clip off the wings of the bat because, of course, there's not much meat wings, but they did have quite the time with the bodies. So somebody benefited. So when these bats die, and I did a lot of studies on the fungus associated with bats, when bats are alive, and of course when any mammal is alive, there's not a lot of fungi that can grow on you. But once you die, there's a huge number of fungi that can grow on you. So this is a dead bat, and you've got sort of succession happening here. So the first fungi to move in are these sort of fast-growing meaty species. So this is probably a mucor or a rhizopus growing on the face of the bat. So here's an ear here, ear here. And then as the decomposition happens, you get a whole variety of other fungi moving in to take advantage. So again, this is the head of the bat here. There's an ear, and the nice wing. And it's very colorful with all these different molds growing on it. And at the end stage, you get a different type of mold. So you can see all this caviar-like. These are ascospores of Microascus caviariformis. So you can see why we called it caviariformis, because looks like caviar. It's a protein-loving fungus. And just to tie this back into my bat box project, another question that I'm asking with this is if the white nose syndrome fungus is in bat boxes. So if bat boxes can be kind of a reservoir for the fungus and contribute to the transmission, so the seasonal transmission. So survivors, if they survive the winter, they still have the fungus on them and they fly to these bat boxes, they could deposit spores in the bat box. I don't think it would be a major concern, especially with some of these really hot bat boxes. The fungus is not going to do very well in there, and it's certainly not going to grow in any of them because I'm sure most of these bat boxes at some point in the summer are going above 20 degrees. So that's not going to be good for the fungus at all. But I am curious if the fungus can be found there and at least survive the summer. A previous study in the United States did find that the white nose fungus does occur in bat boxes, but those particular bat boxes were quite close to a hibernacula, so potentially the bats are flying back and forth between them. The previous study also didn't look at viability of the fungus. They were just detecting DNA of the fungus. So that's another question I'd like to answer is if there is the white nose fungus in these bat boxes, is it alive or are you just detecting the DNA of it? So if it's not viable fungus, it really doesn't matter because of course something dead is not going to infect the bats. So it'll be interesting to see how that project goes. So these are pictures of the variety of fungi that I've cultured off of bats over the years. And then just a big thank you to the many, many people that have helped me over the last decade and a half or whatever it's been. I don't like to think about it, especially the New Brunswick Museum and the Canadian Wildlife Federation. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. That was wonderful. Lots of really good, interesting facts there, things that I didn't know before. So if anybody has any questions for Karen, if you want to just type it in the chat and then I'll pass them along to her. We do have one question so far in the chat. Did bats initiate COVID-19 in China?
That's a hard one to answer. It does look like the virus might have originated in bats, although they still haven't found a very good match. Just the closest match is a virus in bats. I think the closest match is still like 95%. Like if you think of how closely we're related to chimpanzees, that's 99%. So it's still not that close. And it's very unlikely that the virus would have been transmitted directly from bats to humans. No, there was likely an intermediate animal of some sort that was involved there. The bats here in North America don't have those type of coronaviruses. They do have coronaviruses, but they're not the type that cause disease. There's various groups of coronaviruses, so subtypes, if you will. So something we're worried about here actually in North America is kind of the opposite to your question, is humans transmitting COVID to the bats here in North America and creating a new reservoir of fungus. So actually all bat research that involves handling bats has been suspended since the start of COVID here in North America to prevent that from happening. They did do a laboratory study with big brown bats to see if they're a competent reservoir for COVID-19. And good news there, they're not. They would apply huge doses of COVID-19 to these bats and they wouldn't get it. Like they couldn't transmit the virus at all. But of course, that's one bat species out of the 45 bat species that are present in North America. So we still can't say for sure if all 45 are not going to be competent reservoirs for the COVID-19 virus. But that's certainly a concern.
Interesting. Another question: how much are small-footed? Sorry, yes. How much are small-footed and northern myotis affected by the white nose syndrome?
Yeah, so the northern actually appears to be even more affected by white nose syndrome than the little brown bats. They've really been hit very hard with white nose syndrome. It's actually pretty rare to see the northerns anymore. Like even at some of these sites here post white nose syndrome where we're doing research, this was pre-COVID, like we'd get so many little browns and it was so rare to see a northern. So that was a bit downtrodden about that. With regards to the small-footed bats, they don't do as bad actually. I think their mortality rate was something like 70%, you know, which is still not great, but not as bad as the northerns and the little browns, but not as good as the big browns.
Okay, next question. How do your survey team in New Brunswick avoid spreading the fungus from one cave to another?
Yep, so there are decontamination protocols posted online. The Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative comes up with those. So it involves decontaminating all gear that goes into the cave with various chemicals. So there's well, there's a list on the website if you're really curious, but you can do bleach, for example. When white nose first started in New Brunswick, and we just had that one cave, like we did not use any of the gear from that cave in any other cave, because even with decontamination, we were a little worried about that. But at least now in New Brunswick, like all sites have the disease because the bats are spreading it themselves. But we still do the decontamination protocols, but yeah, we don't have the dedicated gear anymore. But certainly all the gear I used in New Brunswick stays in New Brunswick. I never bring that to another province. So the stuff I have here in Ontario stays in Ontario. The stuff in New Brunswick stays in New Brunswick. Very careful about that. And especially, of course, going out west where they don't have it. You really want to not use any gear in the east in Western North America at this time.
Okay. Is Karen willing to help with Bat ID if we have photos?
Well, you can always send your photos to me and I can give it a go. It can be kind of difficult with photos because there's very specific features we look for depending on the species to identify the bat. So if the photo doesn't show those features, it can be quite difficult. But nevertheless, give it a go.
Can a bat become reinfected in another year if it initially recovers?
Yes, it can. So they can be reinfected every year. So it's not like some of our other diseases where you get the vaccine and you have these antibodies and you won't get it again. No, unfortunately, every year they can become reinfected with the disease. We don't know why there are survivors, how they're able to survive year to year with this constant exposure to the pathogen. That's still a question that needs to be answered.
Do you think big browns should be listed as threatened since they are affected?
Well, they certainly are affected. That would be, you have to get more data on population trends. I wouldn't put them as endangered at this point. They might be able to meet the criteria for threatened because it's not just white nose syndrome that they're contending with. They're also being killed by wind turbines. So they have more than one threat to them right now.
I have a question myself, which was you had mentioned that the raccoons were eating the bats, like the body of the bats, and they had the fungus. Does that impact the animal that eats the fungus at all, or not at all?
No, because the raccoons don't hibernate, so they're not decreasing their body temperature. If you don't decrease your body temperature below 20 degrees, you're never going to get the disease because the fungus only grows in the cold temperatures. It just can't hack it when it's too warm.
Okay. When were you first interested in bats?
Well, I didn't grow up thinking bat biologist. No, I mean, I always wanted to study some sort of mammal. And so in my final year of my undergraduate degree, I didn't know if I would like research. I mean, how do you know unless you try? So I signed up to do an undergraduate honors thesis. And of course, when you do that, you don't have a lot of choice in your topic because the professors post projects, you choose a project. So I had a choice between bats and mice. So of course I chose bats. They're so much cooler because they're more like a predator. And that's how that started with Brock Benton, actually, back in 2006.
Okay. That's the end of the questions. If anybody else has a last question, just get it in there quick. All right. That seems to be all the questions, but thank you so much, Karen, for your presentation tonight. On behalf of North Durham Nature, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight and giving your presentation. It was super informative, and hopefully a number of the participants tonight have a bat box that they can be monitoring and keep an eye out for the bats and report their sightings, as well as monitor the bat boxes. So I know there's a couple at my workplace actually that I'd like to monitor and enter into your research. So I'll be in touch with you about that. James, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I would just echo that. That was really a great presentation. I actually work as a consultant, and so we deal with bats at some level. So especially doing surveys where trees are going to be removed to see if they might be there. That was actually news to me about the big brown bat. I didn't know they were affected at all by white nose. I thought I'd read that they weren't affected. So that's a bit disconcerting, because we thought, well, at least the big brown is now the common bat and they'll be okay.
Well, it is the common bat, just because it's not as effective. But yeah, no, they still die from it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually recognize some of the names here, because I know some of you have signed up for the project.
Oh, good, good, good. So that was a very enlightening talk, and I do appreciate you joining us tonight and sharing this information with us. And I encourage anyone out there to sign up for the Bat Box program.
That's my pleasure.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks to everybody as well for joining us tonight.